There's a version of history that doesn't appear in the history books. Not because historians don't know it, but because the people who lived through it, the people who survived it, had every reason to lie about it. And they were very, very good at lying. In the winter of 1476, a man died. The man who would inspire the legend of Dracula. The man whose name alone made grown soldiers weep. The man who ruled through terror so absolute that enemy armies would turn back rather than face his wrath. But here's the thing, and this is where the actual horror begins. Nobody actually knows how he died. We have the official story, the one that survived, the one carved into history books. Vlad the Impaler, they tell us, fell heroically in battle, slain by superior Ottoman forces, a soldier's death. Clean, meaningful, heroic. But what if that's not what happened? What if the real story is so disturbing, so treacherous, so psychologically devastating that the people involved literally erased it from history? What if the man who used fear as a weapon became its final victim? Today, we're going to untangle a conspiracy of silence that's lasted 550 years. We're going to look at the evidence that was hidden, the contradictions that were buried, and the three separate narratives that all somehow became one convenient lie. And what we find is far worse than the battles, far worse than the impalement, far worse than anything you've heard about Vlad the Impaler. This is the story they didn't want you to know. Before we talk about how Vlad died, we need to understand who he was. Not the legend, not the caricature, the actual man. Vlad III of Wallachia, born around 1428. A small kingdom nestled between the rising Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. The kind of place that should have been swallowed by history. The kind of place where princes died quietly, their names forgotten within a generation. But Vlad wasn't quiet. And by the 1460s, he'd done something that seemed impossible. He'd created a military strategy so psychologically devastating that it didn't matter that his army was smaller. It didn't matter that he faced an enemy with vastly superior numbers. Because Vlad understood something that most rulers of his time didn't. That terror, real primal soul-crushing terror, could do what swords couldn't. His method was impalement, thousands upon thousands of impaled corpses. He'd retreat from the Ottoman advance in 1462, leaving behind not just his army, but a message. A forest of stakes, each one topped with a dying or rotting human body, thousands of them. Contemporary accounts speak of 23,000 impaled victims. Some historians say the number is inflated, but even if it was half that, even if it was a third, the psychological impact would have been unimaginable. Mehmed II, called the Conqueror, the man who had brought down Constantinople itself, the greatest city on earth, arrived at Vlad's retreat, expecting to crush him. Instead, he found himself staring at an ocean of corpses, thousands of them arranged, like a grotesque garden, many still alive, rotting in the sun. The Greek historian Chalka was there. He documented it. He described how Mehmed's battle-hardened veterans, men who had seen the carnage of Constantinople's fall, were absolutely horrified. Some accounts suggest they refused to advance further. Some suggest Mehmed himself turned his army around. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the world, the man who had conquered the last great Byzantine stronghold, was psychologically broken by the sight of impaled corpses. He came to crush Vlad. He left traumatized. But here's where the story gets twisted. Because Mehmed couldn't just leave it at that. He couldn't allow the world to see that he'd been psychologically defeated by a provincial prince. He couldn't allow his enemies, and he had many, to know that he'd been broken. So, he did what empires do. He waited, he plotted, and he made sure that when Vlad finally fell, the story would be one of Ottoman might, of imperial superiority, of a victorious conqueror crushing an enemy. The narrative had to be controlled. You're watching this because you can smell the lie and that instinct. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what comes next is where the real conspiracy unfolds, where we expose who benefited from burying the truth. Let's talk about propaganda, because that's really what the S is. That's what all of it is. After the horror of 1462, Mehmed couldn't kill Vlad directly. Vlad had his supporters. He had Hungary backing him, or at least he had Hungary's king interested in him. A direct assassination would have been messy. It would have created questions. It would have given Vlad's allies a reason to rally around his memory. So instead, Mehmed withdrew. He let Vlad's own enemies do the work, and Vlad had plenty of enemies. His own brother, Radu, was in Ottoman service. The Wakian boyars, the nobles who ruled the country, had been systematically brutalized by Vlad's reign of terror. They'd seen their power stripped away, seen their lands confiscated, seen their families destroyed. Many of them had reason to hate him. Matthias Kovanes, the king of Hungary, ostensibly Vlad's Christian ally, had his own plans for Wallachia. He didn't want a powerful independent Vlad ruling there. He wanted a puppet. He wanted control. So when Vlad, desperate and isolated, fled to Hungary seeking aid after being overthrown, Matthias made a calculation. He arrested him. He kept him in prison for 13 years. 13 years. Vlad went from being the terror of the Ottoman Empire to being locked away powerless. And to justify this, to explain to the Pope, to Christian Europe, why he was imprisoning what was supposed to be a Christian hero. Matthias's court produced documents, letters supposedly showing that Vlad had offered his allegiance to Sultan Mehmed. Letters claiming he was a traitor to Christendom. Modern historians almost universally agree these letters were forgeries, but the damage was done. Vlad's reputation, his legend, his status as a Christian hero, it was destroyed. He went from being the impaler scourge of the Ottomans to being a traitor who collaborated with the Sultan, and he sat in prison while the world forgot about him. 13 years. Think about what that does to a man. Think about the psychological deterioration, the isolation, the knowledge that everyone you fought for has abandoned you, that your allies are your jailers, that the legend you built is being rewritten by your enemies. But then something changed. Around 1475, it became politically useful for Matthias to release Vlad. The Ottoman threat was again becoming dangerous. Perhaps Matthias thought he could use Vlad as a tool, a pawn in a larger game against the Ottomans. Or perhaps Matthias simply calculated that Vlad, broken and weakened after 13 years in captivity, would be easier to control than the fierce warrior he'd once been. Either way, Vlad was released. He was sent back to Alea with the goal of reclaiming his throne. This is where the timeline becomes critical. This is where we start to see the cracks in the official narrative, because what happened next happened very quickly. Vlad retook his throne. That much is certain. In late 1475, early 1476, he reclaimed his capital, and then less than 2 months later, he was dead. 2 months, that's all Vlad had. 2 months as Prince of Wallachia after 13 years in captivity. And in those 2 months, something happened, something that killed him. Now, the official story says he died in a battle, a glorious last stand against the Ottoman forces, a heroic death fighting the ancient enemy. But there are problems with this story. Big problems. First, the timeline doesn't match. Contemporary sources give conflicting accounts of when he died. Some say December 1476. Some say January 1477. Some sources are so vague about the date that we can't actually pin down when he died within a span of several weeks. Second, the location is disputed. Where did he die in battle against Ottoman forces? In which battle? Which Ottoman general was present? The accounts contradict each other so thoroughly that historians still argue about the basic geography of his death. Third, and this is the disturbing part, there are multiple theories about what actually killed him, and they all conflict with the official narrative. Let me lay them out for you. This is the official story. Vlad was leading a small force against Ottoman positions. A larger Ottoman force ambushed him. He was overwhelmed, killed in combat. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. This story benefits everyone. It makes Mehmed look powerful. It makes Matthias look like he sent a brave man to a brave death. It gives Vlad a heroic ending. The problem, the details don't hold up. If this was a major Ottoman military victory, why isn't it documented in Ottoman records as such? Mehmed was obsessive about documenting his military achievements. Yet, the sources on Vlad's death from Ottoman historians are remarkably thin. This is darker. In the chaos of battle, Vlad, wearing armor, fighting hard, was mistaken for an Ottoman soldier by his own men, and they killed him. Think about the desperation of that moment. A small Wakian force, probably outnumbered, fighting in winter conditions, in darkness, in absolute chaos. Vlad is in the thick of it, fighting hand to hand. And in the confusion, a panicked soldier, maybe a young recruit, maybe someone desperate to survive, drives a spear through him. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, Vlad is already dead. His own men killed him. And then what? If this was the truth, Vlad's supporters would have a lot of motivation to hide it. It would be shameful. It would be a disaster for Matthias who sent him there. It would be an embarrassment. Much better to have a story about a glorious battle, a brave death, a heroic stand. This is the most disturbing possibility. Vlad had just retaken his throne. He had been absent for 13 years. The nobles who now controlled Lycia, the boyars, had grown used to power. They liked their positions. They didn't want the old terror returning. And there were also Ottoman agents in Lycia. Vlad's brother, Radu, was still alive. He had supporters. What if Vlad was assassinated not in battle, not by accident, but deliberately killed by a conspiracy? Of boy, the same families too. Hat had assassinated his father, that had killed his brother, that had a long history of removing rulers who became too powerful, or perhaps by Ottoman agents, maintaining the fiction of a battle, but actually murdering him through conspiracy. If this happened, it had to be covered up. It couldn't be allowed to surface, because it would expose the boy's risides. It would show that Vlad, for all his power, couldn't protect himself even after reclaiming his throne. And it would show that Matthias's grand plan to use Vlad as a tool had completely failed. Much better to say he died in battle. Here's something that should disturb you. Vlad the Impaler was a man of immense symbolic importance. Whether you saw him as a hero or a villain, he was legendary. He was famous across Europe. His name struck fear into Ottoman hearts. When he died, however he died, you would expect his body to matter. You would expect it to be found, to be documented, to be either buried with honor or displayed as a trophy. But instead, Vlad's corpse vanishes, his head. Yes, that was sent to Constantinople. Mehmed had it displayed on a stake. The ultimate insult. The man who impaled thousands was himself impaled, at least symbolically. The narrative was complete, but his body, the monastery at Snargov near Bucharest, is traditionally believed to be Vlad's burial place. It was excavated in the 1930s. The archaeologists found a grave marked for Vlad. It was empty, or more precisely, it contained only a nimble bones. This is where the conspiracy becomes undeniable, because someone deliberately removed his body. Someone made sure that his grave was empty. Someone erased the final evidence. Why would you do that? If Vlad died a heroic death in battle, why hide his body? Why not display it? Why not give him a proper burial and then publicize it? The only reason to hide a corpse is if the circumstances of its death are too disturbing to be revealed. But wait, there's more. A different discovery was made at the Kana monastery. A site that Vlad himself had founded much closer to where the supposed battle took place. In the 1950s, archaeologists found a headless corpse in a grave, a headless male skeleton dated to approximately the right period. Could it be Vlad? It's possible. It would make sense. He died in battle. His head was taken to Constantinople, and his body was buried at Kamana at a place that was meaningful to him. But here's the thing, it's not certain. The skeleton was never definitively identified. The remains were never conclusively proven to be Vlad. And that's strange, isn't it? If historians truly believed Vlad was buried there, wouldn't they have done the DNA analysis? Wouldn't they have verified the bones? Wouldn't they have confirmed the legend? Instead, there's ambiguity. There's uncertainty. There's a headless corpse that might be Vlad or might not be, which raises a question. What if the body at Kamana isn't Vlad at all? What if it was placed there deliberately, to be found to serve as a cover story? What if the real Vlad, the evidence of how he really is still hidden somewhere? We're getting closer to the truth now because the more we look at the physical evidence, the more the official story falls apart. Let's do something important here. Let's look at who had the power to bury the truth, and let's trace what each of them benefited from the official narrative. For the Ottoman Sultan, the narrative was perfect. Vlad the Impaler, the man who had psychologically broken him, the provincial prince who had humiliated him in front of his own army, was finally dead. And more importantly, Mehmed killed him. The reality might have been more complex. The death might have been messier. Vlad might have been killed by his own men or assassinated, or simply defeated in a chaotic battle that didn't reflect well on Ottoman military prowess. But the simple story, Mehmed's armies defeated Vlad, that served Ottoman interests perfectly. It showed the empire as dominant. It showed that defiance was futile. It showed that even a man as terrifying as Vlad Dracula could not escape the reach of the Ottoman military. This narrative had to be protected. For the King of Hungary, the calculus was different, but equally important. Matthias had imprisoned Vlad for 13 years. He'd held a Christian hero captive while claiming to fight the Ottomans. That was a PR disaster waiting to happen. When he finally released Vlad, sending him to reclaim his throne, he was playing a dangerous political game. He was betting that Vlad would succeed, and that Vlad would be grateful, and that Vlad would become a loyal tool of Hungarian interests. Instead, Vlad died almost immediately. If the truth was that Vlad died in a chaotic, poorly supported military operation, that Matthias essentially sent him to his death through negligence or calculation, that would be a disaster. It would raise questions about Matthias's judgment. It would make him look like he had betrayed Vlad twice, once by imprisoning him, and once by sending him to his death. But if the story was that Vlad died heroically fighting the ancient enemy defending Christendom, then Matthias could position himself as someone who freed a great warrior so he could fight for the Christian cause. It was a redemption narrative, and it required that the truth stay buried. The nobles who ruled Wallachia, the families who had assassinated Vlad's father, who had killed his brother Radu, who had grown comfortable with power during his 13-year absence. These men had every reason to want Vlad dead. They didn't want the terror returning. They didn't want their power stripped away again. They didn't want their families brutalized. If Vlad was assassinated by a conspiracy of boyars, if it was a targeted killing to prevent him from fully consolidating power, then those families would be risides. They would be oath-breakers. They would deserve punishment. But if Vlad died in a glorious battle against the Ottomans, and the boy were not assassins, they were merely nobles in a kingdom that faced external threats. The lie protected them from justice. The records we have come from all these interested parties, Ottoman histories, Hungarian histories, Wallachian accounts written by people who weren't there. No one was documenting the truth. Everyone was documenting a version of the truth that served their interests. And because everyone benefited from the same lie that Vlad died in battle heroically against the Ottoman forces, that became the story that survived. It's a conspiracy, but not in the way we usually think of conspiracies. No one sat down and planned it. No secret meetings, no formal agreement. Instead, it's a conspiracy of silence. A mutual agreement among all parties that the simple story served everyone's interests better than the messy truth. The Ottoman Sultan got a victory. The Hungarian king got redemption. The Wallachian nobles got to avoid being called assassins. And Vlad got to be remembered as a hero instead of a victim of treachery and court intrigue. Everyone benefited. Everyone except the truth. But here's what's really disturbing about this story. It's not just about Vlad. It's not just about a 15th century mystery. It's about how power works, how the powerful control the narrative, how the truth dies not with a bang, but with a collective decision to look away. Vlad the Impaler built his empire on psychological terror. He understood that fear was more powerful than words. He knew that the mind was the real battlefield, and that strategy worked. It made him legendary, it made him feared, it made him dangerous. But here's the irony. The same principle, controlling perception, controlling narrative, using psychology as a weapon, was ultimately used against him. Because in the end, the people around him understood something. They understood that to truly defeat Vlad, they couldn't just kill his body. They had to kill his story. They had to transform his death from a messy, treacherous, possibly humiliating end into a heroic myth. They had to erase the evidence of how he really died. They had to make sure that for 550 years, the world would believe a comfortable lie instead of an uncomfortable truth. And they succeeded. Think about this. Vlad the Impaler, the man who conquered through fear, became a victim of the same psychological tactics. He became a cautionary tale about the limits of power. No matter how terrifying you are, no matter how absolute your control seems, there are always forces stronger than you. There are always people willing to lie about what happened to you. There are always forces rewriting your story after you're gone. The ultimate cruelty isn't the impalement. It isn't the torture. It isn't the death itself. It's being erased. It's having your story rewritten by your enemies. It's becoming a puppet in someone else's narrative. That's what happened to Vlad. That's the real horror. So, here's what I want to know, and I want to hear from you in the comments. We have this clean version of history. We have these heroic myths about how great figures died, how important battles were won, how empires rose and fell. But what if a lot of it is wrong? What if the real history, the messy, complicated, disturbing history, is buried under these comfortable narratives? What other historical figures do you think might have a completely different real story? What other heroic deaths might actually be assassinations? What other glorious battles might actually be chaotic tragedies? And here's the bigger question. If the victors always get to write the history, how much of what we believe about the past is actually true, and how much is just the lie that the powerful needed us to believe? Drop your theories in the comments. Let's dig into these forgotten truths together. And if you want more disturbing history, more stories that the mainstream once buried, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week we're going deeper into the parts of history that make you question everything you thought you knew. Thanks for being here. History is not just about the past, it's about understanding who we are today. If this story made you think, inspired you, or taught you something new, please support the channel by liking this